Here's two ways of thinking about it. What story are you acting out? Or what character resides in you? That's another way of thinking about it. Or what spirit have you allowed to possess you? Or what spirit have you invited in and consorted with such that it can possess you? So when Cain is bitter, Cain from Cain and Abel, Cain is bitter because his sacrifices go unrewarded. So he's bitter because his work is not successful. And everyone should be able to identify with that. There's no difference between work and sacrifice, by the way. They're the same thing. When we work, we sacrifice the present to the future.
Saw that clip from your book.
Yeah, okay. So now Cain's work is unsuccessful, so he gets bitter. And he's jealous as well of Abel, whose sacrifices are accepted and who's thriving. And so Cain's countenance falls. He becomes depressed and anxious and nihilistic and resentful, and starts to shake his fist at God. He does what Job's wife tells Job to do when Job is being tortured. Job's wife says, "Shake your fist at God and die." Well, Cain shakes his fist at God and kills. And so that's even worse. So Cain calls out God, just like bitter atheists do constantly, and they have their reasons, and says, what the hell's going on here? What kind of world did you make? Where I'm breaking myself in half with my labors and nothing is succeeding and everything is bitter and pointless. And God says, if you did well, you'd be accepted. And then he says something much, much worse, which you figured out already. He said, sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory animal, and you've invited it in to have its way with you.
That's dark.
Right. Well, it's terrible. It's terrible. And there's echoes of this in other mythological stories. So what it means is that Cain is suffering, and there's nothing sinful in that as such, right? Because the innocent can suffer. Cain suffers, and then he turns in the direction of temptation. He starts to nurse his resentment. That's another biological metaphor, to nurse your resentment. He starts to brood over his resentment, right? And so what that means is that spirit of arrogant resentment he invites it in, it takes up residence within him, but then he engages in a creative dialogue with that spirit. It's not merely possession, it's conspiracy. It's conspiracy between the eternal spirit of darkness, that's a good way of thinking about it, and a living human soul. That's what happens when you get resentful.
Do you think men are being taught to be weak right now?
Yes, definitely.
No,
it's worse than being taught. They're being enticed toward that in every way.
Tell me more.
And punished for not doing it. Well, they're enticed towards it by, the insistence, for example, that there are modes of less worthy being than the masculine, let's say, because masculinity itself is toxic to its core, a manifestation of patriarchal oppression, that male ambition is nothing but a manifestation of the force of tyrannical power that not only oppresses the oppressed, but rapes the world. Jesus, brutal. So there's that. And then any deviation in that direction, the desire of a 4-year-old boy to play with guns, for example. Well, we have to rub that out. It's like, oh, well, do you? You're going to rub out your son's ability to point and shoot, are you? That's what it'll do his whole life. You're going to go to war with that in your feminine virtue. Toxic masculinity. It's like, great harpy warfare. It's awful. It's awful. But it's part of this belief, and that's derived from this unholy nexus of agreement between the postmodernists and the meta-Marxists, that the only story is one of power, and men wield the power, and therefore all masculine virtue is identical to the striving for power, and that's immoral in its essence. It's basically the most pathological brandishers of that doctrine presume that male virtue is indistinguishable from malevolence. And so the best you can do if you're a man is to castrate yourself. And
Oh, God.
well, that's what's happening in the culture. It's literally happening. It's not even symbolic. That's the offering. That's the ultimate offering to the great mother. That's a great way. Freud knew this, Jung knew this. This is well mapped out. This is well mapped out in the psychological and symbolic spheres.
Because I said, look, what I see in the world right now is what it looks like when women become pathological. That the things that are good, nurturing, wanting to care for people, when that goes too far, and devouring mother would be your phrase, but it's a perfect phrase. It really does.
That's the sin of Eve. That's the eternal sin of Eve. To even clasp the serpent to her breast. My compassion is so overpowering, there's nothing it can't incorporate. Even the fruit of evil itself. That's the fall of man. Yeah, that's being played out like in spades, rapidly, miraculously. Yeah, it's very, very bad. Very, very dark.
So I know that if we don't find a way to make men, I won't even say strong. I think strong is a part of it, but
invite them to be strong.
Invite them to become what healthy masculinity looks like. Now the question becomes, from where I'm standing, I will give you the image that I use a lot. I use this in business all the time. When things are getting really hard, I imagine myself in a loincloth covered in the blood of my enemies with a big fucking sword in my hand.
Yeah.
And that imagery helps me stay focused, be strong, be hard when I need to be hard. Not that I'm, imagining killing indiscriminately, but that I need to be able to step into aggression. And aggression is the right word.
Right.
And when I...
that's why Andrew Tate is so attractive to young men.
Dude. So much. He's utterly fascinating to me. 90% of what he says scares me to death because it actually is toxic masculinity. But 10% is so good that I'm like, you cannot dismiss this kid.
People are complicated, eh? But the thing is that the more... Okay, so the perversion of warrior in some ways is psychopath, and you know that because you watch like mafia movies. So we all know this, okay? But there's a dreadful attraction in untrammeled aggression for men who are so crushed that they're castrated. That's a good way of thinking about it. So the attraction that the Andrew Tate persona, let's say, has on those young men, there's actually a lot of that that's positive. Now that doesn't mean that that's the right target, but there are creative ways of being wrong that are helpful. Right. Now, you see better examples of that, precisely that, in people like Jocko Willink and David Goggins and Joe Rogan. Like, these are tough guys, but they're not.
They don't have the sex appeal, though. That's one thing I'll give Andrew Tate. But
that's partly because they don't want it.
Yeah,
you see,
fair.
But it isn't that they couldn't have it. Like, it's that they've decided that everything in its proper place. Rogan has a family, so that's where he's put it. And hey, man, good work to him. And that sex appeal that Andrew Tate has, that's the sex appeal of the short-term mater. That's the psychopathic sex appeal. That's the dark tetrad sex appeal. It's shallow, and it will get him in trouble. I mean, it's already got him in trouble.
Yeah.
And so that's not going to, unless he, wises up, precisely that, it'll get him in trouble. And I'm not trying to take him apart. I mean, I think what he did with his capitalization on female sexuality is absolutely unforgivable. But, that's enough of that. I mean, that was beyond the pale in my estimation. There's no excuse for that whatsoever. Now, if you're a basement-dwelling incel, the mere fact that you could imagine ever doing that, sort of like you imagining yourself, in a loincloth covered with blood, the mere idea that a man, which is what you are, could even manage doing that, having a harem, of women, who are offering sexual favors at your beck and call. Well, that's a much higher calling than castrated, obese, resentful loser who can't leave the basement, right? Because that's an even low, I suppose, you know, when you're in the lowest rung of hell, the rung right above looks like heaven. And it's up. That aggression is very, very necessary. You know, it's very necessary. And sports are a great way of putting that in its proper place, especially team sports. Because you can take that competitive instinct and that instinct to win, that instinct to be competent more deeply, and you can put it in its proper place. And it is an immense source of implacability. Immense.
Now, in a
It's certainly something I draw on when I lecture, for example. Like, it's a source of energy. It's just sitting right there. Aggression is a very primordial instinct, and it activates both the positive emotion systems, which are forward moving, and the negative emotion systems that awaken you. It's high stress. Like, there's nothing more stressful than being angry. It's very psychophysiologically demanding. It's very psychophysiologically stressful. But
it's also intoxicating.
As a form of alerting arousal, in some ways it's unparalleled. And it's great to have it at hand. You don't want to see, the Freudian model with regard to aggression was repression. Like, we have this terrible id that's trying to make itself clamber upward, you know, all red and tooth and claw. There's some truth in that, but his model of how that was regulated by socialization, it was insufficient. It's not repression, it's not inhibition. Now, he kind of knew that because he talked about sublimation. Jean Piaget had a much better model, much wiser, and Piaget observed actual children. A competitive child who's socialized integrates the capacity for aggression into the game, and then he becomes the player every kid wants on his team because he still wants to win. So he's got that forward driving intensity and skill, but he does that in a manner that brings everyone along with him, right? And so then aggression isn't inhibited, it's integrated. And the more aggression you can integrate, well, the more compelling you are, 100%. Like, that's what women are after. That's because I think the fundamental female hero story is essentially Beauty and the Beast. And a woman is after a civilized beast. Like, literally, that all female pornography has that structure. Civilized beast. You know, and it can tilt a little hard in the beast direction when it gets a little masochistic, and it, you know, can turn a little hard in the civilized direction when it's kind of when it's a romance that tilts more in the direction of friendship. Woody Allen would probably be a good example of that as a character in his own movies. But, you know, you can imagine that there's a range in there where the solution can be offered in a variety of different forms.
Yeah, I think you were the one that pointed me to a book that was utterly transformational, A Billion Wicked Thoughts.
Yeah, right.
What I find really interesting is it isn't just a civilized beast, it is a beast I civilize with my magic hoo-ha, which is what they say in the book.
Right.
But that I find very interesting and has somehow become controversial.
Women probably did the same thing to men that humans did to wolves.
That's fucking interesting, man. Tell me more about that. That is really interesting.
Well, you know, you want a wolf that's trying to eat you, or do you want a wolf on your side? Well, that's the situation women are in.
I found that utterly fascinating, talking about just what men do to get women's attention, the demands that women make it. Yeah, literally. That all the things.
Everything and anything is the answer to that.
100%. My success is literally tied to my desire to impress my now wife. Then fiance, when I really turned it on, I was like, whoa, I've got to become
the correlation between male trappings of socioeconomic success and male reproductive success is it's like 0.7. For women, it's negative. It's zero. It's lower than zero. Like, men don't care at all about men aren't looking in women for what women look for in men.
Correct.
So, and not a bit even. And that plays out also in the structure of female motivation. Men are very competitive. They'll and in unidimensional in some ways, one-eyed, you might say, right? And there's an immense symbolic level, web of associations around that idea. The one-eyed giant. Well, the penis is a one-eyed giant, like obviously, right? And it's a seeking. It's part of a seeking system, seeking women, and it'll do that unidimensionally, right? And men are like that. Freud knew this, that men are like this from the cellular level up. And so they'll specialize, they'll hyper-specialize obsessively in a manner women are just not interested in. They can, but they're not interested in it. And partly they're not interested in it because that isn't what doesn't attract men, that capability. I know the men I worked with in big law firms, for example, hyper competitive men, and they're very concerned about their bonus, but not because they needed the money. They said, well, the money's just a way of keeping score. And they all said that. They all knew that. They laughed about it. It's like they wanted a bigger bonus than the next guy. The amount didn't matter. The comparative amount mattered a lot. And it's part of a status ranking, and that's everything for young men. Status ranking, God, yes. I mean, they'll die for that. They'll kill for that. Like, it's not like we don't know this. It's in the criminology literature. This is crystal clear. The gang, a tremendous amount of gang violence is status competition. But even more than even the economic element of that is subordinate to the status competition. So, yeah, that's crystal clear. So you can imagine the Spirit of God in the Old Testament makes himself manifest in two forms: calling and conscience. And conscience is what you just described. It's like the guardrails. It's like you're going off the path, So there's fences and warnings on the conscience side. But it's the same thing, and it's the dynamic between. This is what happens in the movie Pinocchio. So Pinocchio is called out into the world. His father is benevolent, a benevolent creator. That's Geppetto. He's called out into the world to make himself manifest, to realize himself, to become real. And there's two things that attract him. He wants to go out and learn and have his adventure. That's the calling. But that has to be allied with the conscience. And the reason for that is the calling alone gets him in trouble. Like, first of all, it entices him to becoming a narcissistic, psychopathic, manipulative actor. That's when he's on stage, right? Then it entices him into lying, to get away with things and to get what he wants. So that's another extension of that manipulation. Then it entices him to become neurotic enough so that he can take a permanent holiday. Then he goes to Pleasure Island where he can engage in hedonism. That's where the slavers are, right? And so that's what just the calling alone, will take him places that are attractive but not appropriate. You need a conscience along for the ride, and that's Jiminy Cricket. Right? And Jiminy Cricket is what bugs you. Exactly, yes. And so that's one of the places you can find your destiny, is in what bothers you. There's going to be an array of things that make themselves manifest to you as callings of your conscience. Those are problems. Those are your problems. Why is that your problem? It's like, well, can you stop thinking about it? Does it bug you all the time? Well, hey, there you go. That's your destiny. When Jacob is wrestling with God, that's worship. That's true worship. That's why he's awarded the name Israel. He's the leader of the chosen people because he wrestles with God. So that's manna for the suffering, because it means that if you're genuinely suffering, then God's there in your grasp, right there with you. That's a good way of thinking about it. In the wrestling, Socrates was a wrestler, literally, right? And he was a very powerfully built person. He wrestled before he was a philosopher. It's the same thing. And everyone, thing is about the chosen people of Israel, everyone wrestles with God. Now the question is, in what spirit should you wrestle with God? And I would say, remember who you're wrestling with. That's what God tells Job when he reminds him that, God was there at the beginning of time, defeating Leviathan, fashioning the world. Remember who you're wrestling with. Have a little humility, or a lot, plenty, enough to strip you of your dead wood. Right. And if you're all dead wood, then the fire of God looks like hell.
Can I get you to read something that you said? These are your words, verbatim. This is from your ARC speech. This was when I felt like, okay, I actually really understand what he's doing now. It starts there with the muscle emojis. And just goes to the bottom.
You want me to read it out loud?
Yeah, I think it's better in your voice, because this, for everybody listening, this is part of the speech he gave at the ARC conference.
We're so foolish. We regard those propositions, religious propositions, as something approximating primitive superstitions, when in fact they're the most brilliant intuitions into the fundamental structure of reality that have ever been offered. We predicated our civilization on those presuppositions. And look at it. It's not so bad. We've brought wealth and plenty to billions of people around the world. We've been struggling uphill properly. And if we were wise and faithful and courageous and responsible, we could continue to spread that to everyone. We could eradicate absolute poverty. We could bring about a time of abundance and opportunity for everyone. And we'll do that. We can do that if we hoist the world on our individual shoulders and operate collectively in this harmonious manner and continue the struggle uphill toward the city of God. And that's the truth. It's the truth. It's not some superstition. It's not some primitive defense against death anxiety. It's not the opiate of the people. It's the call to divine responsibility. And to the degree that each of us acted it out in the confines of our own life, we do what I suggested at the beginning of this conference, which is tilt the world toward heaven and away from hell. Okay, so the Mesopotamian gods killed their father, Apsu, and tried to live on his corpse. Well, that's what we're doing when we mouth slogans. We're trying to live on the corpse of the past. And instead of embodying its living spirit, they slay the past. They have no regard for the past, which is also what we're doing, by the way. They slay the past and attempt to inhabit its corpse, like Geppetto in The Whale. It's the same idea. And Tiamat shows back up. She's the dragon of chaos. And her goal is to destroy everything. And that's one of the precursors. That idea is one of the precursors to the flood myth. And the word Tiamat is, they say, etymologically cognate with the word tohu vabohu. And that's the chaos out of which God makes order at the beginning of time. All these ideas are linked.
So if you inhabit dead ideas, you will bring back chaos.
Of course, the dead ideas can no longer sustain you in your active contending with the present. This happens in The Lion King. What happens when Scar takes over the Pride? What happens when Scar takes over Pride Rock? Pride Rock. It's so comical. Scar takes over Pride Rock. Well, why? Well, he's scarred. That's the first thing. He's intellectually arrogant, obviously. And the whole kingdom turns into a wasteland. A dry, sterile, desert wasteland. That's always the case. It's always been the case. And we're seeing the archetypal outlines more clearly now because things are changing at a ever accelerating rate. And so God only knows. What does Jonathan Pajot say? Giants will walk the earth once again. They already are.
What is the Enlightenment? Why do we have to get to the other side of it? Or why do you think maybe we already are?
The Enlightenment is the belief that the material world speaks for itself. And it's not true. You have to see facts through a lens of value. The postmodernists got that right. That's why we are in the culture war to some degree, is the postmodern critique was correct. We see the world through a story. And the facts now indicate that. I've talked with Carl Friston, for example, one of the world's great neuroscientists. Many people know this now. I asked Friston, is an object a micronarrative? He said yes. So
because
even
we have
your
to understand what to do with it.
function, you bet. You don't just see the world. You see the value of the world. And you don't see the world and infer the value. You see the value. You see the value. And the implicit structure of your unconscious is the matrix of value through which the world reveals itself. And properly formulated, that matrix has a multidimensional narrative structure that's coherent, that's reflected in the structure of the biblical stories. And we know that. Well, we say, well, what's the foundational document of Western civilization? Well, obviously, it's the Bible. Like, forget the theology. Historically, well, what does that mean? Well, it means it's the seed from which your perceptual matrix grew. You're a more or less coherent echo of the biblical corpus. That's what you are. And the more you know of the stories, the hyperlinked stories, the more fully fleshed that incarnation, internal incarnation becomes. The Bible was written in consort, you might say, obviously with the function of the human nervous system, both individually and collectively. It was woven together over thousands of years and also evolved to match the structure of our memories, all of that, and the structure of our attention. So the postmodernists, when they realized that we saw the world through a story, which was a brilliant discovery and was made in many disciplines at the same time, by the way, they jumped to the next question, which was, well, if we see the world through a story, what is the story? And they said, well, it's power and its twin sister, its evil twin sister, hedonism, but power. They were Marxists. It's all about power. So have it your way. Play with fire. See what happens. Power. I think power is interesting too, because you might say, well, why would you want power? Like, if I could just ask you to walk along with me, why wouldn't I do that? Why would I have to exercise power over you? Well, how about I want you to do something that you don't want to do? Well, what? How about something for my immediate gratification? That's why Jonathan Pajot has said that the Marquis de Sade is the evil brother of the Enlightenment rational mind. It's like, absolutely. Same thing, same idea explored by Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment with Raskolnikov. Yeah. And this is the problem, is that you don't have a choice about your cross exactly. You only have a choice about how you will bear it, because death and hell are coming for you. And that's that. There's no escape from that. And so all you can choose is the manner in which you confront it. And you can do it voluntarily, wholeheartedly, in good faith, with courage, or you can do it any of the insane multiplicity of other ways that clamor for your attention. That's right. My name is Legion, right? There's a reason for that. Right. So the Christian message fundamentally is that your best bet, all things considered, truly all things considered, is to take the whole burden on. Like eyes wide open, right? That's what Abraham does, for example, when he goes on his great adventure. And that's what Job does. There are precursors to this idea in the Old Testament stories. It's in some ways fully revealed. That's a good way of thinking about it in the New Testament stories. So Christ's claim is that he embodies the Spirit in the Old Testament. You think that's right? I think that's the simplest explanation. And it has to do, you said already that people can allow ideas to possess them. So what idea should you allow to possess you? Well, the insistence in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that you should invite in the spirit of your ancestors, the unified, monotheistic, creative loving, kind, truthful spirit of your ancestors. Something's coming in. Or a multitude of things. How about a diversity of things? How about a rainbow of things? Or a plurality of things? What, under some united flag? The union of diversity? I don't think so. It's no wonder that we believe in the union of diversity when we believe that a man can be a woman. If we believe those things, there's nothing we won't swallow. No camel too big to go down our throats. No totalitarian lie we won't rush to embody. So you asked earlier, where are we headed? Like, every single person is making up their mind about that. Well, they always have, but it's really evident at the moment, and it's going to become a lot more evident than it is. I met a woman once in my clinical practice, man, this was something. She was as damaged a person as you could hope to contemplate. So she looked like a street person. She'd come to this behavior therapy clinic that I worked in as a student, and she was dressed like a street person. You know, she had this old ratty winter jacket on that was really dirty, and she stooped over. She wasn't very tall to begin with. She stooped over, hunched over, and she approached everyone like this, which made people shy away from her because it's an odd method of approach. But the reason she did that was she was really so timid and so humble that it was as if anybody that she approached had a light that was emanating from them too unbearable for her to behold. So it wasn't so much an oddity, although it was, as a preternatural humility. And I thought she had come to the behavior clinic because she wanted help. She was an outpatient at a psychiatric hospital that I worked at. And she couldn't communicate very well, partly because of her shyness, partly because her first language was French, which maybe she could communicate perfectly well in French, but I doubt it. She was not an intelligent person, technically speaking. You know, she was intellectually impaired, and probably in the bottom 10th percentile of the population. That's a pretty rough place to exist cognitively, you know. You're barely literate at that point. And her mother was very ill and was bedridden, and her mother had a boyfriend who was a violent alcoholic schizophrenic who was always haranguing her about Satan, and like, man, she had a rough life. She just didn't have anything going for her. She wasn't an attractive person physically, you know, and people shied away from her. She just was the downtrodden of the earth, you know, in the realest sense. And that bloody woman, you know, she actually came to that behavior therapy clinic. She'd been an inpatient. And this was a rough place, man, because it was a hospital after deinstitutionalization, and there were tunnels connecting some of the wards to other wards because it's so cold. This was in Montreal. It's so cold in the winter. They built a hospital on these tunnels, and I took my brother there one day, and it was like walking through Dante's Inferno. I mean, if you were so psychiatrically impaired that you weren't released in the 1980s when deinstitutionalization was maybe at its peak, you were so damaged that there was just no possibility that you could function in the outside world. So the people that were left were sort of the most demolished of the most demolished. And so just walking through there for my brother, who had no experience in such things, was traumatizing, you know. And she had been in the inpatient ward for some time and then was released, and she wanted to talk to the hospital administration because she got out and she got this dog that she took care of and went for a walk, and she really liked this dog and she took care of it, you know, and she walked with it, and she wanted to see if she could go find one of those inpatients who was worse off than her and take them for a walk every day with her dog. You know, it's so funny, eh? You meet someone like that and they just have nothing. They have nothing in the world that you would recognize as any marker of success or status or ability, or they're outcast and tortured, and then nonetheless, you know, a woman in that dismal state was able to rise above her own catastrophe, which was like manifold, and find someone worse off to try to serve. You know, you don't need many experiences like that to convince you that there's things about the world that you truly don't understand on the ethical front, you know. So I would say, when you're at the crossroads and you're counseled to despair, you know, rise up in courage and see if you can resist it. It's better for you and it's better for the people around you. You know, I was reading a Wikipedia article on the Tower of Babel the other day. I'm always curious about how these things are represented most publicly, right? And Wikipedia is a great way to do that because it's collectively edited. And the interpretation was essentially, it was the description of how the languages of the world arose. And I don't think that's what that story's about at all, except peripherally. I thought, yeah, you just missed the point 100%. I mean, Babel is Babylon first, so you need to know that. And Babylon is the state that's gone mad. And it's a continual temptation for human beings to build complex organizations, right, that get too high. And so what does that mean? How about too many layers? Not local enough, not distributed enough, right? Too separate from the people that they serve. I think the EU did that. I think that's why the British left. That's the Tower of Babel. In fact, unbelievably, they used a famous painting of the Tower of Babel as a representation of the EU in some of their literature, which I think it was a painting by Bruegel, but I'm not sure of that. But that was just like, okay, I just do not understand how that happened at all. In any case, this Tower of Babel, it's also a Luciferian story. You know, Lucifer is the spirit of intellect, the light bringer, who's flown too high and challenges God himself and falls. And in Milton's story, Lucifer is called on his pretension by God and said, you know, because he is God's highest angel, God most catastrophically wrong. So a symbol of intellect, that in combination with the notion that he's a light bringer, it's a symbol of prideful intellect. And it is the prideful intellect that raises itself against what is most properly placed at the highest place, which is what God is, whatever that is. Whatever it is, it's not the intellect. That's a subordinate spirit. And if it isn't, then it becomes aimed essentially at something approximating hell and perfectly capable of creating it and then perfectly capable of ruling in it. And so when God calls Lucifer on his rebellion, he says, if you but repent, you could be welcomed home. And Lucifer says, well, I am the sort of spirit that even if I once repented, I would be instantly tempted to merely repeat my mistake. And he says as well, I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. It's like, hey man, there's a choice for you at the crossroads. And so, you know, people have asked me, for example, I'm very opposed to the idea that the fundamental human motivation is power, which is pretty much what every student is taught at every level of their education, in every educational institution, except a handful now across your country. Fundamental motivation is power. There's no place for people of goodwill to meet and engage in constructive dialogue, dialogos, none of that, because our fundamental motivation is nothing but the will to power. And so there is no place for people of goodwill to meet. There is no such thing as dialogue. It's all a mask, a rationalization, a post hoc rationalization for pretension and power. It's such a dismal philosophy. It's so, you could not, and I believe this technically, you could not formulate a more pathological philosophy. It obliterates your faith in society, and it eradicates the notion of the individual. It removes the notion of good faith and goodwill, and it makes communication impossible. It's like, that's a temptation to engage in that sort of destruction as a consequence of your intellectual pretensions, let's say. And for all of you, this is going to face you too, this pretension, you know. So maybe you're not the hopeless type, and the temptation that assails you at the crossroads isn't your degeneration into a kind of faithless nihilism. Maybe it's a self-aggrandizement in some sense instead, and that you feel that now you have the opportunity to serve your own ambition. Take apart what that means, because I think it's worthwhile. Psychopaths serve their own ambition. And they're the people who are most truly motivated by power, by the way, if you think about it clinically. And they're not very successful, all protestations to the contrary. They never rise above about 3% of any general population. And maybe it's a better strategy to be a manipulative psychopath than to lay inert in your bed, in your mother's bedroom when you're 40, but it's not an optimal strategy. And so you can get away with it being a psychopath because you can mimic competence and you can take advantage of people who have learned to expect the best from others, and so you can manipulate them. But you produce nothing on your own. And one of the things that's really interesting about psychopaths is they don't learn from experience, which means not only do they betray other people constantly, but they betray their own future selves.
And there's really no difference between your future self and someone else, right? You know, if you're going to act ethically, and this is a very good way of thinking about acting ethically, you act in a way that works for you now, that works for you tomorrow, that works for you next week and next month and next year and in 5 years and in 10 years, and for you and your family and your friends and your broader community, and all of that simultaneously. And that's a place to find purpose in your life, to manage that balancing act simultaneously, and to sacrifice your narrow, self-oriented pretensions, ambition, all of that, the celebration of your own intellect, the construction of your own empire for your own narrow purposes. Part of the reason you shouldn't do that, even though it's tempting in some sense, especially if you have the ability, is because, do you want to rule over hell? I mean, and that's another interesting question with regards to the question of whether power is a valid motivation. It's like, okay, well, Kim Jong-un, let's take Kim. He's a manifestation of a power player. You think it's better to be leader of North Korea than to be just an ordinary peon there? Are you so sure it's better to rule over hell than just to be a servant in hell? It's not obvious to me. That's not success by any stretch of the imagination. The most powerful devil. That's like the worst possible failure. And so, you know, you're called upon to take the lessons that you've been taught in a university like this, that attempts to teach you to abide by the eternal verities, to sacrifice your own narrow pretensions in the highest sense to something that's truly better, not because you should in some finger-wagging sense, but because there is truly nothing better, and perhaps you don't have the wisdom to see that, because it's difficult to see. It's difficult to have a purview broad enough to encompass those expanse of time and community and see what pattern of behavior is to be manifested in proper service to balance all of that in some musical manner. But that's definitely the appropriate pathway.
I talked to Franz de Waal 2 weeks ago. He's the world's greatest living primatologist, perhaps. And de Waal's work is unbelievably important. It's unbelievably important because he's concentrated on the idea of the alpha male. And you know, we have in popular parlance, we have an idea of the alpha chimp, right? Or the alpha male for that matter. And it's pretty much a postmodern neo-Marxist view of primate sociology. And that is that the biggest, ugliest, meanest male dominates by brute force, and so now he's at the top of the pyramid. And so the implicit claim there from the biologists is that power, those who express power most effectively, power being the ability to compel, those who express power most effectively will dominate the pyramid of dominance, of social hierarchy, and they'll prevail reproductively. Well, that's pretty gloomy, that idea, you know, but people think, well, that's how you look at the world if you're sensible. It's like, well, Franz de Waal's been studying chimps for 30 years, and that's not true. That is not what happens. He told me flat out that frequently small male can become alpha, especially if he has the support of an influential female. And the small male becomes alpha and has the support of the influential female, not because he expresses arbitrary power, but because he's unbelievably good at mutual reciprocation. And so he has friends, and he does things for his friends, and they do things for him, and they trust each other, and he has lots of friends, which also means he has no enemies, which turns out to be really important because the brute chimps, like the psychopath alphas, they do rule now and then, but they get torn to shreds by their enemies because, you know, they're tough, let's say, and mean, but they have an off day, and two chimps they stomped a week before ally together and literally tear them into shreds. And so the psychopath chimp types who use power to attain dominance have very short rules and end in a very bloody way. And so de Waal has pointed out, like Piaget did among children, that power is an unstable ethic upon which to base a social hierarchy, even for chimps. And chimps are male-dominated, they have a patriarchal society, and they're relatively brutal. And it doesn't even work for them. It certainly doesn't work for human beings. So whatever is at the apex of the pyramid, it's not, as the bloody Marxists insist, the raw expression of power and exploitation. Wrong. Not the case. Doesn't even work in nature. Doesn't work for rats. Doesn't work for chimpanzees. Certainly doesn't work for people. And then there is a kind of natural ethic that emerges out of that, right? Because with rats and with chimps and other social animals, it varies to some degree from species to species. There's the necessity for something like mutual reciprocity as the basis for successful social organization. And that's something like treat your neighbor like you would want to be treated.
So why work 80 hours a week? Well, men will do it, some men, very few. A handful of hyper-competitive men who are obsessed with hitting the pinnacle of the given dominance hierarchy they're in will happily work 80 hours a week, and they'll forego everything else. Relationships, family, children, way in the second category. And so those men are often very difficult to live with too, because they're so obsessed with their career. It's hard to have a relationship with them. And maybe they don't have much of a relationship with their kids, but they're damn good at what they do. And part of that is they're smart and disciplined, and they'll work non-stop all the time. It's like an obsession. And that's the sort of people who run things. Those are the people who run things. Well, they're often also disagreeable too, because you want to manage people? Really? They're not going to like you. And it's not an easy thing to not be liked. And actually, if you're an agreeable person, and women are more agreeable than men, it's quite painful to be disliked. But if you're in a managerial and executive position, the probability that people are going to like you is quite low. Those positions are very stressful, partly because of the interpersonal dynamics, and they're also incredibly competitive. So we've got things backwards in our culture. We're thinking, at least in part, why aren't there more women in positions of power? Wrong question. The right question is, why are there any men at all who want those positions of power? Because it's not just positions of power. You have to be such a knothead to think that. Oh, it's a position of power. It's like, sure, but it's a position of overwhelming responsibility. And if you make mistakes, you're done. Right? It's not like you occupy that position of power and everyone does what they're told all the time and your life is easy. It's like, forget about that. People are on your case to do exactly the right thing all the time, 100% of the time. And maybe you want that, and maybe you don't. So I don't know what people think is these people are all sitting in their offices with their feet up on the desk, smoking cigars and oppressing the world. It's like, that isn't how it works. Those people, they work flat out all the time. So, and it's fine if that's what you want, and some people are like that. They're hyper-industrious people, right? From a trait perspective, no matter where you put them. If you put them in a forest with an axe, they just wander around chopping down trees non-stop, right? Because it's built into them. But if you want to have a balanced life, and you should want that, because the other thing you'll find, and this is God's gospel truth, is that the older you get, if you have any sense at all, the more important your family is to you. Like the utility of your career, maybe that peaks around 35 or 40, and it starts to decline pretty rapidly after that. And what happens, if you're fortunate, you have someone in your life that you love, that you've woven yourself together with, and you have some kids so that you have something to do from the time you're 50 till the time you're 80. And so it's a real mistake. It's a barren future without children, man, I can tell you that. It's a real mistake. And so we do a terrible job of say, putting that image forward and saying, well, yeah, now, because women have access to the birth control pill now and can compete in the same domains as men, roughly speaking, there is a real practical problem here. It's partly an economic problem now, because when I was roughly your age, it was still possible for a one-income family to exist. Well, you know that wages have been flat, except in the upper 1% since 1973. Why? Well, it's easy. What happens when you double the labor force? What happens? You have the value of labor. So now we're in a situation where it takes two people to make as much as one did before. So we went from a situation where women's career opportunities were relatively limited to where they were relatively unlimited and there were two incomes, to where, and so women could work, to a situation where women have to work and they only make half as much as they would have otherwise. And now we're going to go into a situation, this is the next step, whereas women will work because men won't. And that's what's coming now. So there was an economist article showing that 50% now of boys in school are having trouble with their basic subjects. And you look around you in universities, you can see this happening. I've watched it over decades. I would say 90% of the people in my personality class are now women. There won't be a damn man left in university in 10 years, except in the STEM fields. And it's a complete bloody catastrophe. And it's a catastrophe for women, because I don't know where the hell you're going to find someone to have a, you know, to marry and have a family with if this keeps happening.
You know, you watch all those rom-coms where there's always kind of a beta male guy who's being real friendly and always failing miserably with the women because basically he's lying to himself and to them. He's a persona, and a persona is the face that you show to the world when you're trying to pretend and to convince yourself and others that you're, I would say harmless, but we could say a good person. But a good person isn't harmless. A good person is capable of, well, maybe a good person is capable of anything, but is willing to hold that in abeyance.